Hello, in this video, I want to continue some of the videos I've been doing before in terms of taking some ideas from authors that I see a lot in debate and arguments that I see often in debate and doing these like large series breakdowns in terms of talking about all the various ways that I think that these arguments change different ideas in debate and what I think are some of the better way to execute and answer these types of arguments. Hopefully these series have been really helpful for you so far and hopefully they'll continue to be helpful. In this one, I want to start a series talking a little bit about Derrida. The reason I particularly want to talk about Derrida, and I don't think that I would really do this series unless like the water topic was happening next year, but it is because I think that there are definitely a lot of resolutions where Derrida doesn't fit as easily. I definitely think it can be read a decent bit, but I think it can be sometimes really hard to figure out where it can like fit the best in terms of being a really strong critique. But I think in areas like the water resolution, for just how rich the history is on the water resolution and the way that it's affected so many different groups of people in various ways and has been like a source of like how various types of governmental structures or institutions themselves have tried to exercise various forms of like control and exercises like capital, etc. I think make Derrida particularly interesting on this topic, and so I want to talk about what some of the basic ideas that are kind of most seen often and come from Derrida the most and that you see the most. Talk a little bit about the way in which you'll kind of see them on the water resolution, and then talk a little bit about how you see these arguments on the affirmative and the negative. A lot of the stuff that you'll see from Derrida coming from both the affirmative and the negative really isn't always taken directly from Derrida, although I've definitely seen teams that have used some of his work in a lot of specific criticisms, and I don't think that it's particularly impossible to, but a lot of times people have taken concepts from Derrida, the way that he talks about things like deconstruction and hauntology, and have used them to talk about various ways in which we can respond to things like anti-blackness, settler colonialism, etc. And you'll definitely see a lot of these ideas, I think, in the ways that people talk about water, because if you think about histories of like slavery, native genocide, etc., a lot water is like tied to these histories in really, really intricate ways that still really influence the kind of present way in which we experience these things. And so I think Derrida will definitely show up in one way or another in a lot of the like water topic as a whole. I think that when you're trying to figure out what are some of the things that you'll see the most from Derrida, the first thing that you'll see in debate that I think is really important is to understand the idea of deconstruction. Derrida is kind of like entering French philosophy basically around like the mid to late 20th century, and is really writing about various things like phenomenology, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and like throughout his like period of time of writing was like really writing it like in all types of different literature bases, from like psychoanalysis and political theory to like anthropology and like sociolinguistics. And so he's done a lot of stuff, especially trying to identify what is the relationship between text and meaning, what is the idea of how people perceive the world versus like the literal reality of the world, and is really trying to think through what those things mean in terms of like how we kind of read and understand and interpret text moving forward. Deconstruction is a method for him to do such a thing. His argument was a disagreement with the idea that there is this kind of like true form or essence to a thing, that there's always this kind of like excess or necessary outside to it that like cannot be captured by the way in which we write it in books, the way in which we try to discern it through text. The actual kind of like experience or things or ideas that are reflected through like these mediums don't actually give us the truth or the actual like existence of the thing in its like rarest form. And that disconnect kind of frames a lot of the ways in which he thinks about like the possibilities of like what happens and what we kind of make this disconnection between text. And a lot of that stuff kind of becomes like a methodological way for how he writes across like various books and different writings. One of the most popular writings that you'll see from Derrida often used in debate, or that is often referenced to, and a lot of the things that people are referencing when they use Derrida in debate, is Spectres of Marx, The State of Debt, The Work of Mourning, and The New International. In this book, Derrida talks about a lot of really interesting concepts and is not identifying himself as like a strict communist or Marxist, but is talking about the specific ways in which the kind of like ghost of communism, the idea that the West had defeated communism, had like taken over and changed like the ideologies for how like economic oppression and inequality would be created and how it would affect like Western development and development around the world. A lot of the arguments that Derrida was making was about how the kind of like the specter of communism was continually kind of like haunting the West, and it was kind of creating these decisions that ultimately move us closer to warfare, moves us closer to fascism, towards foreign debt, towards like underemployment and the deportation of immigrants, etc. All of which are really interesting places, I think, to really talk about the relationship that like water as a resource has, particularly to these things. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think that just in general, keeping this idea of like how Derrida is trying to talk about the possibility of like reading these events and the ways that these events are critiqued in the eyes of Marx, etc., through a deconstructive lens, but also remembering how Derrida thinks about like the past and the way that it presents, how we think about the politics of the present and the future. This kind of leads us into talking about something specifically thought of within the writing of Spectres of Marx, which is the idea of hauntology. Hauntology is the idea of like, or the manner of thinking about the way in which a ghost, or the kind of like presence, the metaphysical presence of an event, a structure, a kind of like a contingency, kind of like changes the way in which we frame politics in the present and the future. It is the idea that there is these kind of like historical events that create a kind of collective cultural memory around like the idea or existence of such things that then frame how we act going forward. And like, for instance, in the context of like how a lot of people have written about Derrida in the context of anti-blackness, slavery kind of like haunts the way in which we kind of like think about the existence of certain politics and the status quo, the ways in which certain communities may be blocked from having water or access to certain resources, etc., all are possibly kind of like informed by the way in which we understand the presencing of like slavery as a system that continues in the present. I think that similar types of arguments that take in various different types of historical contingencies and kind of make them on their own sorts have come from arguments about settler colonialism, arguments about capitalism, etc. And I think all of these kind of really frame the types of questions that you want to ask in the water resolution, because I think that water has such a history that is rich in the way it is defined, how people have controlled various populations and exerted control over like land and resources, that there's a lot of history to pull from in terms of what really haunts the way in which we think about like how water and various resources are deployed in the status quo. And I think really talking about the ways in which that in this specific resolution is definitely a place where you can bring about a lot of different histories in order to really talk about the ways in which like water exists in the present and why that should define what type of politic we should have moving forward. And thus I think it's something that you could read on the affirmative and the negative. I think when you're thinking about it as an affirmative strategy, I think it's really good when you think of hauntology as a political method or an epistemology to evaluate how we think about the presencing of what types of decisions that we make, right? How do we understand if, you know, slavery, if settler colonialism and native genocide kind of follow us through these decisions? How do they inform the types of like morals or ethics we take up, or the way in which we think about the political decisions we make in the future? And then I think on the negative, it's a question of how you can build these as ways that you can create methodologies that really are about using the alternative as a way to like haunt, or actively use as a kind of way to critique the affirmative as like this kind of like active deconstruction in and of itself. And I think really think about ways that you can kind of perform that through the act of the process of debating can be really interesting ways that you can put Derrida into a lot of the arguments I think you can use to frame stuff moving forward. Hopefully this video was helpful for you as an intro to Derrida, to get you an idea of like some of the ideas of what he's talking about and what are some of the ideas that will kind of frame some of the videos I'll be doing going forward. And hopefully you'll keep tuning into the series because I really like doing it. Thanks.